as I talk. I'm going to do this in a fairly formal way because I'm reading out some bits of sources in places and so on. And I'm not going to be looking mostly at text or theological text, but rather at legal and social issues as they affected marriage and the Church of England in the 19th century. And I'm going to take you on a kind of journey, in a way, from what you might call a kind of early modern understanding of marriage to something much more recognisably like a modern understanding of marriage, whatever that might mean. But I'm going to begin in 1838. In 1838, the young Charles Darwin was contemplating marriage to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. On a sheet of blue paper that has fortunately survived, the fact that it survived is itself revealing. If I were him, I would have destroyed it. He drew up what one historian has called a cost-benefit analysis of marriage. Under the heading, "This is the question, marry, not marry," he listed reasons on either side. This is what he wrote under marry: children, if it please God; constant companion who will feel interested in one; a friend in old age; object to be loved and played with; better than a dog anyhow; home and someone to take care of house; classics of music and female chit-chat; these things good for one's health; forced to visit and receive relations; crossed out but terrible loss of time. My God, it is unthinkable to think of spending one's whole life like a neuter bee, working and nothing after all. No, won't do. Imagine living all one's days solitarily in a smoky, dirty London house. Only picture to yourself a nice, soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books, and perhaps. Compare this vision with dingy reality of Great Marlborough Street, where he was living at the time. Marry, QED. His reasons against included not forced to visit relatives, because he thought this was a good thing, loss of time, and less money for books. This startling and amazingly honest testimony is a really good glimpse, not just into the mind of Darwin, but into the pitfalls of historical evidence. Certainly, it captures and expresses a whole host of attitudes we'd find deeply shocking today. But it would be a mistake simply to assume that Darwin's own summary of reasons to marry actually exemplified the man's own approach to marriage in practice. 29 at the time, he already knew his cousin Emma well. We probably have to assume then that the nice, soft wife he was describing was already in his mind's eye a real person with whom he probably believed himself to be in love. Moreover, Darwin was to become a very family-centred man, a man whose marriage was famously strong and affectionate, and whose relationship with his children was of the closest, so close indeed that the death of 3 of them in childhood, particularly his daughter Annie, shook his Christian convictions to the core, so that he ended his life as an agnostic and non-churchgoer, though much less known, generally supportive of his local parish church, and of course to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Darwin isn't necessarily a better place to start thinking about marriage in the 19th century than anywhere else I could perhaps pick from the vast range of evidence available to us. But this testimony, with all its ambiguities under the surface, is a way of sharpening up the questions we might want to pose about the social attitudes that underlay any formal doctrine of marriage. For the truth is that the formal doctrine, if by that we mean what we've been hearing about, what the Church of England taught about marriage, primarily through its liturgy and canon law, and then secondarily through the opinion, the teaching and preaching of clergy, scarcely changed much in the course of the 19th century. In fact, it scarcely changed at all until the mid-20th century. A little bit more on that later. But that does not mean that marriage in Britain did not change. What marriage means at any one time, how it's received and understood by the people entering into it at any one time, is a matrix made up of many different factors, including, of course, formal church teaching and liturgy, but also including social expectations, bodily awareness and understanding, gender relations, power and property relations, and so on. So what I'm going to look at is not so much church teaching as such, but rather the social and legislative context in which Anglican understanding of marriage was embedded in the 19th century, and indeed on into the early 20th century. And why pick this period out? Because despite lots of disagreement between historians about what constitutes the modern world, even to the extent nowadays of arguments about whether or not there was ever such a thing as the Industrial Revolution, still, in a common sense way, we can surely note that the so-called long 19th century, from roughly the end of the 18th century through to the early 20th century, represented a period in which Britain passed into a world recognisably modern. By 1914, it was a world with a steamship, the combustion engine, powered flight, radio, the telegraph, film, the telephone, amongst other things. It was also a world in which pressure for women's equality was gathering momentum, in which rapid advances in the human and natural sciences were underway, and in which historical criticism had shaken confidence in the authority of the biblical text. Of course, it was the world of our grandparents and great-grandparents, and it was also very different from now. All the same, I think it's justifiable to focus particularly on changes in the 19th century as a way of sounding out important aspects of the historical context of marriage in Britain today. And first of all, I think it's important to get out of the way any idea you might have, which I think would have been well laid to rest by what you've heard today anyway, that the historical trajectory of marriage, even in this wider sense, showed essentially no change until the 19th century, and then a gathering pace of change up until the present. It's a peculiarly modern conceit. In fact, the history of marriage had already registered significant change many times, long before the period I'm dealing with. And even on its eve, as we heard from Hannah, we have to reckon with one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation affecting marriage in Britain, Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1753. The aim of this piece of legislation was to suppress the practice of clandestine marriage, by which, so it was claimed, respectable men or women had been ruined by being duped into hastily arranged clandestine weddings with those posing as good prospects for future partners, and presided over by unscrupulous clergy anxious for a quick fee. Some London churches have specialised in performing weddings and taking the fees to an astonishing degree. It was reckoned that there were around 40,000 weddings one year at St James Duke Place, for example. And that it's the story goes, or the contemporary quotation is, that at St Pancras, I quote, "there's such a coupling that they stand behind one another as 'twere in a country dance." The Act did away with this kind of nonsense and insisted on a proper process requiring parental consent for those under 21 for the issuing of licences, and with, of course, enforceable residence requirements for banns. It also, in effect, tied in legal recognition of marriage to the church service and ended the common law acceptance of the mutual swearing of vows as the making of a marriage. The only exceptions to the requirement of a Church of England ceremony were Jews and Quakers, though these were legally recognised exceptions. Here, then, we can already see several things at work which were to play themselves out, one way or another, in the subsequent history of marriage. Reform aimed at underpinning and not marginalising marriage. Questions of legal recognition and regulation, protection of partners, and with an especial concern about property implications, and the alliance of church and state, a consequence of what some historians have called the confessional state, namely the assumption that civil peace required the promotion of religious uniformity and conformity, which in effect, in England and Wales, meant the promotion and privilege of the Church of England. That last point was already being criticised and tested in the 18th century, and therefore was likely to be pushed further by dissenters and Roman Catholics. And we can trace the interplay of these considerations and others through focusing on four major changes in the course of the 19th century. The first, to which I want to draw attention, was perhaps the most significant and far-reaching. It was the creation of the system of civil registration for marriages by 2 Acts of Parliament passed in 1836, effective from 1837, that have become the bedrock of civil marriage in Britain today. This was a consequence of a series of measures which in 1828 to 1832 effectively dismantled the central pillars of the confessional state, namely the discriminatory legislation preventing dissenters and Roman Catholics from participating fully in the political process. Putting dissenters and Roman Catholics in the House of Commons, something permitted in 1828-9 and made immeasurably easier by the First Great Reform Act of 1832, inevitably brought into prominence their remaining grievances, and the obligation to perform legally binding marriages according to the rites of the Church of England was certainly one of those. So the motivation for the civil registration system, this is a point often missed, was essentially religious. It was to support marriage as it might be celebrated by dissenters and Roman Catholics, by creating a parallel system of civil registration of which they could take advantage. It was also deeply conservative in a social sense. It was aimed at creating a cheap, relatively easy system of conducting marriages that would encourage the labouring poor to formalise their common law relationships into proper marriage. For this reason, though passed by a Whig Liberal government with dissenting support, these measures rapidly attracted support from across the political and religious spectrum. The creation of the civil registration system was a typically British fix or fudge. Anglicans and Presbyterians in Scotland, of course, wanted to retain the connection between the religious ceremony and the role of registrar. Dissenters wanted freedom to marry without the obligation to use the Anglican service. So parallel or permissive arrangements were put in hand, whereby church weddings remained legally binding, but a civil equivalent was available for those who wanted it. And the rise of civil marriage was very gradual, from around 5% of marriages in England and Wales in the 1840s to around 30% by the 1940s, only passing the 50% barrier in the 1970s. The second legislative change was divorce reform in 1857. Before then, divorce was the preserve of the wealthy. It required the pursuit of a case through the ecclesiastical courts, not the civil courts. That followed, of course, from the church monopoly of marriage originally. And almost invariably involved a petition and bill, separate bill, in the House of Commons, which was, of course, very expensive. With the implication too, since in England divorce required proof of a wife's infidelity, that a couple's intimate secrets could be debated openly in Parliament. It's hardly surprising there weren't very many of these bills. It was also hardly surprising, as a contemporary newspaper pointed out, that in Prussia, a smaller country but with a legislative tradition influenced by the Lutheran sanction of divorce, there were 2,000 or 3,000 divorces a year, but in England only 2 or 3. The difference in England was made up by what a newspaper called undivorced but miserable couples, and by an extensive system of infidelity, concubinage and prostitution. Certain classes have, moreover, their sale of wives. Now, just a word on that. Sale of wives is worth a comment in passing. Since divorce was impossible for the poor, the folk practice of wife sale sprang up as a rough and ready popular alternative, a mock method by which a husband and wife might release themselves from their marriage bonds, at least in practice, if not technically in law, by selling or auctioning the wife to an alternative prospective partner. If you know your Hardy, you'll recognise that from the beginning of the Mayor of Casterbridge. Divorce reform, through the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, was not, however, brought about by a principled defence of divorce as such, but by a recognition both of the inequity of the existing legal provision for divorce and of the extraordinary complications, too great for me to cover here, resulting from the differences between the Scottish and English legal systems. Moreover, by the mid-19th century, the effect of religious revival, especially the evangelical revival, had helped bury the old double standard, as one historian would put it, of the 18th century, namely the assumption that women should be subject to heavy social and legal penalties for adultery, whereas men's adultery could be calmly tolerated. Divorce reform, in other words, was actually meant to be effective in bolstering marriage, not undermining it. It was meant to help establish a legal level playing field for women and men in terms of their understanding of the establishment and, if necessary, dissolution of the marriage bond. In summary, the new measure transferred divorce cases from the ecclesiastical courts to a new civil court, the Court of Divorce and Matrimonial Causes, and streamlined somewhat the process of petition. This did not lead to a Prussian-scale flood of divorces, however, as some feared at the time, even if the number successfully pursued did rise substantially. Now, in case I didn't emphasise this enough, it's worth teasing out one particular aspect of what I've just been describing, and that's the growing and not receding influence of religious considerations in shaping the law on marriage in the Victorian period. It's been conventionally described for a long time by historians that 19th century is a time when religious influences are receding, and that they claim you see particularly legislative change such as the creation of civil registration of marriage showing the rise of secular influences. But this is not really convincing. Religious considerations became, if anything, more powerful in the course of the 19th century, but there was a significant shift away from the acceptance of Anglican hegemony. What we can now regard as the rise of a secular alternative was really a result of attempts to reinforce Christian marriage by accommodating different religious consciences. Freedom of conscience in the operation of marriage, just as in other areas of British life, was given legal force in the interest of recognising religious difference, but with the definite assumption that freeing up areas of social life from Anglican control would actually increase competition between denominations and promote the evangelisation of society. A third area was not actually one which touched directly on the making or unmaking of marriage, but on its consequences, and that's reform of the law of property as it affected married women in 1870 and 1882. This was really an implication of the gender equalisation of the law of divorce, though it similarly owed much to religious sensibilities, and not least, once again, to the recognition that the rich had much more room for manoeuvre than the poor. Before reform, formally, the situation of a married woman was clear. Whatever she owned in her own right at marriage, or was given afterwards, became the property of her husband. The potential abuse of this was evident, and had been for a long time. You only have to think how much the novels not only of Jane Austen, but also Anthony Trollope, George Eliot and others, revolve around the potentially perilous position of women who either did not possess fortune and so sought to marry it, or whose wealth was the prey for predatory, fortune-seeking men. In practice, again, various legal devices, such as the creation of trusts under the law of equity, could for the rich achieve a measure of protection. Lower middle class and poor women had no such recourse, and were, at least in law, entirely dependent on their husbands. As one historian put it, there was an implicit, if irrational, assumption that women only married for love, leaving the two fathers and prospective husband to worry about such practical considerations as finance. Married women indeed had no recognised legal standing so far as property ownership was concerned, whereas by contrast, both single and widowed women retained property rights. So the two acts of 1870 and 1882, passed after concerted campaigns by various groups, including advocates of women's legal equality, extended legal protection successively to property acquired by women after marriage, and then to property already possessed at the time of marriage. Again, one can see this cutting two ways. Yes, helping to establish equality, but also removing a disincentive to single or widowed women to get married. On a long perspective, even though none of these discussions touched directly on the question of the prayer book service and the Church of England doctrine of marriage, you can see the build-up to the apparently minor but remarkable change achieved in the 1927 revised prayer book, the one rejected by Parliament, when for the first time the possibility of taking identical marriage vows, in other words, taking out the obey, was recognised. Finally, I want to deal with a fourth area of legislative change, one which had important implications for marriage in Britain, but which I know will sound to your ears unbelievably arcane. It was the issue of the marriage of a deceased wife's sister. When I was a child and a choir boy in my local parish church choir, in idle moments during sermons, especially for some reason wedding service sermons, I used to be fascinated by the table of kindred and affinity published in the prayer book, which set out forbidden relationships of marriage. It was almost always tucked away furtively at the back, and if you remember or know, it lists under two parallel columns, one for a man and one for a woman, those whom one could not marry. For example, a man, I quote, may not marry his grandmother, his grandfather's wife, his wife's grandmother, mother, daughter, and a couple of dozen other forms of relation, including his wife's sister. Now, obviously, the table is not only about blood relationships. Of course, a man may not marry his mother. But say he married a woman, she died perhaps even before the marriage was consummated, and then he fell in love with her sister. Why could he not marry her? Or suppose, and this proved to be the really pertinent example, suppose he did have a child or children by a wife, but she died, perhaps in childbirth, and he then wanted to secure his children's future by marrying the sister of his dead wife. In other words, might not the upbringing of motherless children, the integrity of family property and inheritance, and family security in general, be protected by marriage to a deceased wife's sister? The question is always put this way round in terms of gender relationships at the time, by the way. What possible objection could there be? Well, Scripture, for one thing, perhaps. Many certainly held that the prohibitions of consanguinity in Leviticus 18, especially 18 verse 18 and 20, included this one, though they conveniently forgot that Jesus seems not to have been shocked in Matthew 22 by the Sadducees' challenge that a woman might be married to 7 brothers in succession. Nevertheless, this became a touchstone for some versions of biblical authority. A bill introduced into Parliament in 1857 was strongly opposed by high church and evangelical clergy alike. Bills were introduced again and again, 1886, 1889, 1894, 1896 and 1898, to try to effect the ending of this prohibition, to no avail. Archbishop Edward White Benson was a particularly virulent opponent, and he's a very interesting symbol of changing attitudes. A man who, aged 20 as an undergraduate, sat his cousin Mary, who was 12, on his knee and proposed marriage to her. He waited 6 years to marry her, but Mary proved to be rather attached to women and had a series of passionate, possibly or probably in fact non-sexual relationships with women, though she did bear him 9 children in all, 5 of whom died in childhood, to his great grief. Benson, by all accounts, was a nervous man who overcompensated for his depression and public shyness by bullying his family and treating his wife as a child throughout his married life. It's somehow not surprising, then, to learn that he was a particularly ardent defender, not only of marriage in itself, but of sexual purity. He was, of course, a headmaster. Headmaster to archbishop was the most common career path to Canterbury in the 19th and early 20th century, the most recent being Geoffrey Fisher. And he was particularly exercised by what he calls the flood of evil overwhelming the public schools, by which he plainly meant sexual temptation, or more specifically, sexual talk, masturbation and homosexuality. So concerns about defending the purity and sanctity of marriage were behind his opposition to the legalization of marriage to a deceased wife's sister. But he did nevertheless perceive something really momentous about the idea, namely that this would be the first serious breach between the law of the Church of England and the law of the land. Opposing the 1896 bill in the House of Lords, for example, he claimed that, "My lords, the clergy do not sit in this house only as ecclesiastics," hear, hear. "They do not sit with narrow preconceived ideas, They sit here as Englishmen and citizens, and they cannot be a party to a ruinous breach in our marriage law. I cannot look lightly upon this idea of setting church law and state law at variance. A bill was not finally passed into law until 1907, years after Benson's death. But however peculiar Benson's psychology, he was essentially right in his assumption of a breach. 1907 represented the first point at which a gap opened up between the formal doctrine of marriage, albeit in a minor mode presented in the prayer book, and the law and practice of civil marriage. That meant that from 1907, not much more recently as sometimes assumed, we can really take it that there were two different doctrines of marriage sanctioned or recognised in some sense legally in Britain. Even if separated as yet on a relatively narrow point, nevertheless a prohibition still defended by the Church of England and enshrined in the prayer book was no longer relevant in civil marriage. The breach was wider still if one took into account the growing practice of remarriage of the divorced, something after all practically impossible in the Church of England until relatively recently. So I want to draw to a close by making three concluding points briefly. The first is simply to restate what I've just said. The history of marriage in modern Britain is situated within a broader history in which very far-reaching constitutional changes have substantially altered the relationship of church and state since the 18th century. We may have an established church still, but its scope and reach are much more restricted than was once the case, and it has long ceased to be true for the majority of British citizens that the church's doctrine of marriage, I mean in its completeness, in its full sense, is what constrains their understanding of what they are entering into when they get married. Second, as we've seen, in any case, the formal church doctrine, called it that, as it has been embodied in practice, was shaped by many competing factors and influences that have changed substantially over time. Consider Darwin again, with whom we began. His enumeration of reasons to marry is shocking indeed. That is the point of my quoting it. Scarcely anyone would be likely to look at things his way now, and particularly to do so and astonishingly preserve the record of it amongst his family papers. We must be wary of absolutising any particular historical model of marriage and of saying, this is how it must be. And I suspect this is especially so in a British context, because we do not live in a society shaped fundamentally by the practice and traditions of Roman law. So that the notion of codification of law, making sure everything is fully self-consistent and tidy, is not one with which generally we've been comfortable. This may be changing under the impact of European legislation and especially human rights law, but the incremental, customary tradition of common law has hitherto led us to accept, perhaps reluctantly at times, a lot of untidiness and apparently inconsistent or incompatible elements within the one system of justice. Finally, history as a study has its limits. Historians should not have the last word on everything. Just because we must attend properly to context does not mean that we should stop trying to work things out for ourselves. The very fact that a sea change in the practice of marriage, and therefore its implications and understanding, occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries, even as the formal church doctrine remained largely unchanged, suggests that there are theological norms to which church people nevertheless should pay attention, discuss and critique. We can't simply construct a Christian doctrine of marriage by looking at people's practice alone, but nor should we ignore human experience. Thank you.
Thank you.